to Down the Rabbit Hole. My name is Breezy, and here we talk about history, urban legends. Did I say history? I think I said it twice. Uh, Paranormal activity, and then many more stuff. Like anything we can just go down the rabbit hole and discuss. So, on today's episode, we are going to be discussing how this American socialite became the first female member of the British Parliament, and that is Nancy Witcher Longhorne Astor, who is also a viscountess, who was a viscountess in everything. So, how did this American born become a British politician? And who was and how did, like, seriously, that is a major feat right there, let alone to be the first American woman. Now, and everything. So what do we know about her though? We know she was born in Danville, Virginia. We know she was raised in Greenwood, Virginia, and her first marriage was to socialite Robert Goldshaw II, and was unhappy, ended in divorce, and she did move to England, where she would marry the American-born Englishman Waldorf Astor in 1906. Now, I do plan on talking about the Astor family a little bit later on down the road as part of my old money family. So, family series here on this podcast. So be on the lookout for that. Um, but after her second husband succeeded to the peerage and entered into the House of Lords, the she entered politics as a member of the Unionist Party, which is now called the Conservative Party, and she won his former seat in the Plymouth Senate in 1919 after becoming the first. This was thus becoming the first woman to sit as MP in the House of Commons. And during her time in Parliament, she was an advocate for temperance, welfare, educational reform, and women's rights. And she was an ardent anti-Catholic and anti-communist, and she received criticism on her anti-Semitism and sympathetic views toward the Nazis, which was ultimately her downfall in the end. Now, she served in Parliament until 1905, where she was persuaded to step down, as her outspokenness had made her into a political liability and got her into a little bit of trouble in the final years of the Second World War. And she retired from politics, largely withdrew from the public, and the following in the death of her husband. And she would die in 1964 in Lincolnshire and was interred at her family estate in Cliveden. So, what about her early years do we know about her? Well, we know she was born um, Nancy Witcher Longhorne in Danville, Virginia. She was the eighth of 11 kids born to a railroad tycoon, Criswell Dabney Langhorne and Nancy Witcher King. Followed by the abolition of slavery, Criswell struggled to make his operations profitable, and was the destruction of the war, and the family lived to near poverty. And for several years before Nancy was born, after the family, her dad gained a job as a tobacco auctioneer in Danville, the center of bright leaf tobacco, and a major marketing and processing center as well. In 1874, he won a construction contract with the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad using the former contacts from his service in the Civil War. By 1892, when Nancy was 13, her dad had reestablished his wealth, and he had built a sizable home. And the Quiswell Langhorne later moved his family an estate known as Meritor in no, later moved his family estate, um, known as Mirador, and this is in like Albemarle County, Virginia. Now, if anybody's from Virginia who has any knowledge of this, like any like if it's like these residents still exist, please let me know in the comments. I love finding stuff like this. That's my travel bucket list, please, guys. But did I say it's like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications? I don't remember. I think I got so excited I just wanted to jump into this episode because it's so long. But anyway, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications if you haven't already, and if you're new here. But Nancy had 4 sisters and 3 brothers who all survived to adulthood. All of her sisters were known for their good looks and everything. And Nancy and her sister Irene both attended or finishing school in NYC. Now, there is where Nancy would meet her first husband, socialite Robert Goldshaw, a first cousin of Colonel Robert Goldshaw, who commanded the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first unit of the Union Army, and to be composed of African Americans. And they married in New York City October 27, 1897, when she was 18. The marriage, it was an unhappy one, and Shaw's friends and said that Nancy became puritanical and more rigid after her marriage. Her friends saw that Shaw was an abusive alcoholic, and during the 4 year marriage, they had one son, Robert Goldshaw III, who they would call Bobby. Now, Nancy left Shaw after numerous times during her marriage, the first time during their honeymoon, and in 1903, Nancy's mom died. At that time, Nancy had to gain a divorce and move back to Mirador to try to run her father's household, but was unsuccessful. In 1904, this is where she would take a tour of England, taking her son with her, um, and with whom she had gained custody, and she fell in love with the country. Since she had been so happy there, her father suggested that she move to England. Seeing that she was reluctant, Nancy's father said that it was also her mom's wish and suggested that she take her younger sister Phyllis with her as well. So this is when Nancy and Phyllis were moved to England in 1905. Their older sister Irene had married an artist, Charles Dana Gibson, became a model for Gibson girls. Now, what was life like for Nancy in England? Well, it was there she had already became known in English society as an interesting and witty American with numerous and wealthy young American women have followed into her aristocracy, and her tendency to be saucy in conversation but religiously devout and also prudish in her behavior confused many of the English men, but pleased some of the older socialites. Now, Nancy had began to attempt to show her skills at winning over critics. And she once was asked by an Englishwoman, "How do you come to get How have you come to get our husbands?" And her response was, "If you knew the trouble I had getting rid of mine," charmed her listeners and displayed the wit and everything. And I really feel like, since she was born in Virginia, she really had like this Southern accent. I can't really be sure of that, but I think that would be pretty awesome right there. And they do say Southerners are the closest thing to the British accent whenever, especially when we get angry. If you ever make a Southerner angry, you know you've gone too far. But anyway, she would marry this Englishman, and albeit, guess where he was born? In the U.S. by Walter Astor, and I wonder if that's where Gossip Girl got the last name Walter from. Okay, I'm going down another rabbit hole that I really need to focus on this rabbit hole. But anyway, when he was 12, his father, William Walter Astor, had moved the family to England to raise his family in the English aristocratic style, and the couple was well matched as both were American expatriates and they had with similar temperaments, and they were also the same age, even born the same day. Conveniently, very interesting, which was May 19th, 1879. Now, Astor shared some of Nancy's moral attitudes and had a heart condition that many contributed to his restraint. After their marriage, they moved to Cliveden, a lavish estate in Buckinghamshire on the River Thames, and it was a wedding gift from the Astor father. Now, Nancy Astor developed a prominent hostess to the social elite. And the Astors owned a grand London house, which was number 4 St. James Square, which is now the premises of the Naval and Military Club. And a blue plaque unveiled in 1987 commemorated the Astor at St. James Square. Though her many Through her many connections, Lady Astor became involved in a political circle known as Milner's Kindergarten and is considered liberal in their age. And the group advocated for unity and equality among the English speaking and continuous in the expansion of the British Empire. So, what about her religious views? So, with Milner's kindergarten, Astor began an association with Philip Kerr, and this friendship would begin to be important in her religious life. They would meet shortly after Kerr had suffered from a spiritual crisis regarding to be once a devout Catholic. Um, and they were attracted to Christian Science, to which they would eventually convert. And after converting, she would begin to proselytize that faith and a role for Kerr's compensation to it. She also tried to convert Hillary's Bullock's daughter to Christian Science, which led to a rift between them. Now, despite having Catholic friends as Belloc at the time, Astor had religious views which included a very strong vein of anti Catholic. And Christopher Sykes argues that Kerr, an ex Catholic, influenced this, but others argue that Astor's Protestant Virginia origins are political are sufficient explanation for her anti-Catholic views. Now, she also had attempted to discourage the hiring of Jews and Catholics to senior positions in the Observer and a newspaper owned by her husband. And in 1927, she was reportedly told James Louis Garvin that if he had Catholics, Bishop would be there within a week. So what? So let's talk about the first campaign for Parliament. Thank you, Kylie. So several elements of the Viscountess influenced her first campaign, but she became a candidate after her husband succeeded his peerage to the House of Lords in 1919, and he had enjoyed a promising political career for 7 years before World War One in the House of Commons. Now, after his father's death, he succeeded him to become the second Viscount Astor, and he automatically became a member of the House of Lords, which means he had to basically forfeit his seat at the Plymouth Sutton in the House of Commons. With this change, this is when Nancy would decide to contest the by-election for the vacant parliamentary seat. Astor had not been connected with the women's suffrage movement in the British House. However, she had arrived at Paddington Station on the day after the election by a crowd of suffragists, including unnamed women who who have been imprisoned in a hunger strike. And once the beginning of our era, I am glad to suffer through this. So, Nancy was not the first woman was elected to the Westminster Parliament. That was archived by Constance Markievicz, and who was the first woman MP to be elected to Westminster in 1918. But she was an Irish Republican. She did not take the seat as a result, and Lady Astor is sometimes erroneously referred to the first woman MP or the first woman elected to the UK Parliament, rather than the first woman MP to take a seat in Parliament. Now, Markievicz later said that Lady Astor was of the upper class out of touch, and Countess Markievicz had been in Holloway prison for Sinn Féin activities during her election. Now, Astor was hampered in the popular campaign for her published and at times vocal teetotalism of the ignorance in the current political views. She appealed to the voters on the basis of earlier works of Canadian soldiers, allies with the British, charitable work during the war, and her financial resources of the campaign and her ability to improvise. Her audience appreciated her wit and ability to turn the tables on hecklers. And once a man even asked her what the Astors had done for him, and she reported, "Why, Charlie, you know." Now, and later, there had been like a picture taken of him, and the informal style baffled yet amused the British public. She rallied the supporters in the current government, moderated the prohibition views, and used women's meeting to gain support by the female voters. A by-election was held November 28, 1919. And she took her seat in the House on December 1st as a Unionist, also known as a Tory member of Parliament. Now, this is where she was the first woman to be elected through what would become termed as the halo effect of women taking over their husband's parliamentary seat, a process of which accounted for the election of the 10 women MPs, nearly a third of women elected to Parliament between the first two world wars. What were her early years in early Parliament like? So, her parliamentary career was the most public phase of her life. She gained attention as a woman and as someone who did not follow the rules, often attributed to her American upbringing. On her first day in the House of Commons, she was called to order by chatting up with a fellow House member, not realizing she was the person who was causing the commotion. She learned to dress more sedately and avoided the bars and smoking rooms frequented by men. Now, early in her term, there was an MP by the name of Horatio Bottomley. That sounds like a very fun name to say. I'm not gonna lie. And she who wanted to dominate the soldier's friend issue and believing that her to be an obstacle sought to ruin her political career. And he capitalized on the opportunity to divorce reform and efforts to maintain wartime alcohol restrictions, and blandly portrayed her as a hypocrite as she was divorced. And she said that the reform bill she opposed would allow men to have the same kind of divorce she had in America. Bottomley was later imprisoned for fraud. Thank you, Kylie. Which Astor used to his advantage in the other campaigns. Used to her advantage in other campaigns. Now, she made friends with among the women MPs, including members of other parties. Margaret Wintingham was elected after had been in office for 2 years, and she befriended Eleanor Wilkinson, who was a member of the Labour Party and a former communist. And she proposed creating a women's party, but the female Labour MPs opposed that as the party was then in office as he promised them positions. Now, over time, political differences separated women MPs. By 1931, she had become hostile to the female Labour members such as Susan Lawrence. Nancy's accomplishments in the House of Commons were relatively minor, and she never held a position which meant influence or any other post in the ministerial rank, although her time in the House of Commons saw four conservative prime ministers in office. The Duchess of Athol, who was elected to Parliament in 1923, 4 years after Nancy, rose to higher levels in the Conservative Party before Nancy, and she felt she had more position and she would be less criticized by the party's government. And during this period, Nancy continued to be active outside government by supporting the development and expansion of nursery schools for children's education. And she was introduced to the issue by socialist Margaret Macmillan, who believed that the late sister helped guide her in her life. Nancy was initially skeptical of this aspect, but the two women became close, and Astor used her wealth amid their social efforts. Although active charitable Although she was very active in charitable efforts, she became noted in a streak of cruelty. On hearing of the death of a political enemy, she expressed her pleasure. And when people complained, she did not apologize, but said, "I'm a Virginian. We shoot to kill." Angus Angus MacDonald, who was a Virginia friend, angered her by marrying without consulting her of his choices, and she later told him regarding his maiden speech that really must do better than that. And during the course of her adult life, she alienated many with short words as well. And during the 1920s, Astor made several effective speeches to Parliament and gained the support of her intoxicating um, liquor, which would become nicknamed Lady Astor's Bill, raising the legal age from consuming alcohol from 14 to 18. And her wealth and persona brought attention to the women who were serving the government, and she worked to recruit women into civil service, the police force, education reform, and the house force. And she also was well liked in the constituency as well as the U.S. during the 1920s, but her success generally believed to have declined the following decades. In May 1922, she was a guest of honor at the Pan American Conference, which was held by the League of Women's Voters in Baltimore, Maryland. and she became the first president of the newly formed Electoral Association for Women in 1924. And she chaired the first international conference in science, industry, and commerce, 3 days, which was a 3 day event held in London in July 1925, which was organized by Carolyn Haslett for the American Women's Engineering Society in cooperation with other women groups. Astor hosted a large gathering of the homes in her home in St. James, which enabled networking amongst the international delegates and spoke strongly um, for her support in the women in the fields of science, engineering, and technology. And she was concerned about the treatment of the juvenile victims of war crimes as well. So, what about the 1930s? What was it like? What was that like? In the 1930s, there was a decade of personal and professional difficulties for her. In 1929, she won a narrow victory over the Labor candidate. In 1931, Bobby Shaw, her son from her first marriage, was arrested for sexual offenses, as her son had previously shown tendencies toward alcoholism and instability. Her friend Philip Kerr, now the 11th Marquis of Lothian, suggested that the arrest might act as a catalyst for him to change his behavior. He was wrong. And Nancy would make a disastrous speech stating that alcohol use was the reason for England's national cricket team being defeated in the Australian national cricket team. Both the English and Australian teams objected to the statement, and she remained oblivious to her growing up popularity almost to the end of her career. Her friendships with George Bernard Shaw helped her through some of the problems. And although her non-conformity caused a friction between them, they held opposing political views, and they also have very different temperaments. His own tendency to make controversial statements or to put awkward situations proved to be a drawback for her political career. Now, after Bobby Shaw was arrested, Gertrude L., a Pennsylvania Railroad heiress from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, offered to provide a guided tour of Moscow for Lady Astor and Bobby. Because of the public's comments by her and her son during this period, her political career suffered, and her son made many flattering statements about the Soviet Union. And Nancy often disparaged it because she did not approve of the communism. In a meeting, she asked Joseph Stalin directly why he slaughtered so many Russians, but many of her criticisms were translated as less challenging statements. Some of her conservative supporters feared she had gone soft on communism, and her questions to Stalin may have been translated correctly, only because he insisted on being told what she had said, and the conservatives felt that her son's praise of the Soviet Union served as a coup for the propaganda that were unhappy with the tour and everything. Now, Nancy was reportedly a supporter of the Nazis as a solution to what she saw as the world problems of Jews and communists. Starting to lose all respect for this woman here. And in 1938, she would meet Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., who was a well-documented anti-Semite, and she asked him to take no offense to her anti-Catholic views, and she wrote, "I'm glad you're smart enough not to take my views personally." She honestly now sounds like she would be a Karen, like in her later life. If that's offensive, I apologize, but she sounds like she would definitely be a Karen. And she highlighted the fact that she had a number of Catholic friends, and Astor and Kennedy's correspondence is reportedly filled with anti-Semitic language, and Edward J. Renhan Jr. Now, Nancy commented that Kennedy told Hitler to do worse would have to do worse than give a rough time to killers of Christ for Britain and America, and Armageddon to save them. She also made various other anti-Semitic views, such as her complaint for the Observer newspaper, which had also been owned at the time by her husband, which was full of homosexuals and Jews, and at the time of anti-Semitic exchange between MP Alan Graham in 1938, was described by Harold Nicholson as basically saying, "I do not think you behaved very well." David Feldman was a Pew Institute studies anti-Semitism, had also related whilst being known to Savoy Hotel in 1934, and where Nancy asked the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and that there must be something in the Jews that had brought them to prosecution. Now, some years later, during her visit to New York in 1947, she apparently clashed with reporters renouncing her anti Semitism, telling one of them that she was not anti Jewish but gangsterism instead of going to solve the Palestine problem. Nancy was deeply involved with this so-called Klassen set, um, which was basically a category of aristocrats that were described by one journalist as having subscribed to their own form of fascism. In this capacity, Nancy was considered a legendary hostess for a group of 1936 that welcomed Hitler's foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who communicated that Hitler's regarding the likelihood of agreement between Germany and England was singled out in the Ostergrove and one of the circles. Now, that Sunday newspaper, Reynolds also supported that Cleveland had been the center of friendship with the German influence. To that end, several of her friends and associates, especially Marquess Lupton, were involved in the policy of appeasement with the Nazi Germany, and Astor, however, was worried that the group might be involved with pro-German conspiracy. William Waldorf Astor as well. Now, at the time of the request from Felix Frankfurter, a future U.S. Supreme Court justice who was Jewish, Astor intervened with the Nazis in Vienna, secured the release of his Jewish uncle Solomon, and she occasionally met with the Nazi officials in keeping the Neville Chamberlain policies, and that she was known to distrust and dislike the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, and she was alleged to have told the Nazi officials that she supported German rearmament because the country was surrounded by Catholics. Yeah, I don't like this woman. Now, she increasingly became harsh in her anti-Catholic, anti-communist sentiments, and after the passage of the Munich Agreement, she said that the Czech refugees fleeing Nazi oppression and communism should seek asylum with the Soviets instead of the British. While supporters of appeasement felt that to be out of line, the Marquess of Lothian encouraged her comments. Now, what about during World War II? Well, when World War II began, she admitted that she had made mistakes voting against Chamberlain, but left-wing hostility to her political remained. In her 1939 speech, the Labour MP Stafford Cripps called for the member of Berlin. Now she also had her fears of the Catholics increased when she made a speech that during the Catholic conspiracy, subverting the Foreign Office. Based on her opposition to communists, she insulted Stalin's role as one of the Allied powers during the war, and her speeches became rambling and incomprehensible. And on one occasion, she accosted young American soldiers outside the House of Parliament, saying, "Would you like to go in?" And the GIS asked, "You're the sort of woman my mom told me to avoid." Okay, I don't know why that's so funny. It is. So, the period from 1937 to the end of the war was personally difficult for her. And in January of that year, she lost her younger sister Phyllis, who was the only surviving, who followed her by her only surviving brother in 1938. And in 1940, the Marquess of Lothian died, and she had been her closest Christian Scientist friend even after her husband converted. George Bernard Shaw's wife died 3 years later, and during the war, Her husband had a heart attack, and as did their marriage grew cold, likely due to the discomfort and health problems. And she ran a hospital for Canadian soldiers, as she had during the First World War, but openly expressed a preference to the earliest soldiers. She sounds like a Karen, honestly, and okay, I gotta respect that you're the first woman, the first MP on Parliament, but still, I, mm, I don't like her. And it was generally believed that during World War II speech, she referred to a man in the Eighth Army as fighting for the Italian campaign as a D-Day Dodgers. Let's talk about her final years now. Now, Nancy believed her party said that her husband caused her retirement in 1945. As the conservatives believed that she had become a political liability in the final years of World War II, her husband said that she stood in office again for her family would not support her, and she conceded. But a contemporary report says she was both irritated and angry about the situation, and she would struggle with retirement, which also put further strain on her marriage. In her commemorating speech of 25 years in Parliament, she stated that her retirement was forced on her, and it should please the men of Britain and everything. So, the couple began traveling and separately and would soon live apart. Lord Astor also began to travel toward left-wing politics in his later years and excavated their differences. However, they would reunite before his death, September 30th, 1952. Her public image also suffered, and as her ethnic and religious views were increasingly out of cultural with the British and everything. Now, during her U.S. tour, a group of African American students said that they should aspire to be more like black servants and to remember their youth. On a later trip, she told African American church members that they should be grateful for slavery because it had allowed them to be introduced to Christianity. In Rhodesia, she proudly told a white minority government leaders that she was the daughter of a slave. Yeah. In 1956, she became increasingly isolated, and in 1959, she was honored by receiving the Freedom of City by Plymouth and everything. By the time she had lost all her sisters, her colleagues Red Ellen Wilkinson died in 1947, Bernard Shaw died in 1950, and she did not take well to widowhood. However, her son, Bobby Shaw, became increasingly combative and everything. And she would die in 1964 at her daughter's Nancy Astor's home in Grimsworth Castle in Lincolnshire. She was cremated, and her ashes were interred at the Ogden Temple in Cliveden. Now, there was many questions, like she was known for exchanges with Winston Churchill, and though most of these were not documented, he told her that having a woman in Parliament was like having one intruder in the bathroom. What about her legacy? Well, in 1982, the BBC broadcast did a nine-part did a television drama series called Her Life, Nancy Astor, which starred Lisa Harrow. A statue of Lady Astor was installed in Plymouth near her family home. And in 2019, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of her election to Parliament. Now, her anti-Semitism has been widely documented and been criticized in recent years, particularly in the former Prime Minister Theresa May's 2019 unveiling statue as well. And during the George Floyd's protest in 2020, the word Nazi was spray painted at the base of the statue, with the first listed on the website of Topple the Racist. Now, she had children, of course. There was Robert Gallshaw III, William Waldorf Astor II, Nancy Phyllis Louise Astor, Francis David Langhorne Astor, Michael Langhorne Astor, John Jacob Astor VII, who went by Jakey. Um, but that is it for this episode. Join me next time as we talk about Mary Golette and I will see y'all next time.